Hello fellow fly fishers, I'm Lance here at our shop here in Orem, Utah, and I'm with
Cheech.
El Chicho. We want to talk to you a little bit about selecting a fly rod specifically for Euro nymphing. Some of the questions we get asked often are things like which length do I need, which weight should I get, and so on. So some of the options that we carry the Orvis Recon, the Orvis Helios 3, the Cortland Mark II, and the original competition nymph, the Echo Shadows, and then Cheech has some of the Scott rods as well.
A lot of people don't realize, but Scott does make 10-footers. I have the Flex and the Radian both in a 10-foot 4-weight.
So we have Euro rods currently ranging from about $250 up into the truly high-end rods in the $800 plus range. In the near future, we hope to also have some of Echo's new rods that put you down into the 100.5 category. So you don't really have to spend a lot to get into Euro nymphing. However, it's worth mentioning the differences in, I guess, why you should get a Euro rod specifically. The thing we get asked almost daily about Euro rods is, do I really need one? Do I need a long light rod, or can I just get away with my 9-foot 5-weight? I'm sure you've encountered that same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that lightweight rods make a big difference. I went out and my arm got worn out because, even holding a light fly rod up above your shoulder really can wear your arm out.
Especially when you're small like Cheech, he's kind of wimp, so it wears him out pretty quick.
Exactly.
No, but he's right. The weight of the rod makes a big difference. So that's one of the reasons we get long light rods. We don't use 5 and 6 weights. We're using most commonly 3s, but occasionally a 2 or a 4 weight. This is a 10-foot 3-weight Orvis Recon that's very, very light. They're also quite soft as far as action goes. That's because we're not relying on the fly line to bend the rod. We're using the leader and flies, so the rod has to be soft enough to bend under its own mass and then propel your flies through the cast.
That's my baby too. This is probably my favorite Euro nymphing rod. Talk about the reel seat as well.
Yeah, good point out. So good call out there. The reel seats on most Euro rods are down locking. The reason for that is to put more of the weight at the base of the rod to help balance it with less overall weight. So with an up locking seat, it takes a heavier reel because you're moving the mass forward. So a down locking seat allows you to balance with less weight, and then as you're holding it up over the course of the entire fishing day, it fatigues your shoulder and arm quite a bit less.
All right, so another thing is, we sell rods anywhere from 10 to 11 feet. A lot of us fish 10 and a half feet. Not so much on the 11-foot side, but some of the 11-foot rods will give you a little bit more reach. Thing to remember is the longer the rod, it's going to add a little bit more weight to your rod. And so it's not a big deal. You just need to take a little bit more care to balance out your rig.
Yeah, true. My experience is the 11-footers that are available currently, like Cheech said, they're a little heavier, they wear you out. I find they're less accurate too, so 10 and 10 and a half to me is the sweet spot. Also, we mentioned a little bit about the lighter weights, 3 and 4 weights, really most of the time 3s. But the most common question we get there is, what if I'm catching big fish? And the answer to that is you don't have to worry about a big fish on a 3 or a 4 weight. You're not limited by the rod, you're limited by your tippet. So you can't, you're going to apply plenty of pressure, let's say, with the tippet on a 3-weight rod to break off even a smallish fish for that matter. But a big fish, you're not going to gain any fighting ability by having a 5 or a 6 weight, because you can already apply maximum pressure to break 4x, 5x, 6x tippets that we're commonly using with Euro nymphing. So you don't need a heavier rod to fight those fish. In fact, the opposite is true. A softer rod will actually bend more and protect your tippet. So the heavier rod's not an advantage for this particular technique.
So we're going to talk a little bit about reels now and how to balance that. We're going to head on over to the reel section. Okay, we're going to talk about getting a reel for your Euro rod, which my strategy is just buy the most expensive one, right?
Right, yeah, that always works.
Yeah. No.
Well, maybe not necessarily. The more expensive reels, though, do have an advantage. I would argue for Euro nymphing specifically, any reel that's machined is usually done with a more precise process, so the tolerances, the gaps between the reel and the frame will be less. And when you have a thin leader or thin Euro fly line, some of the less expensive reels tend to have more play from the frame to spool, and the line can actually slip through there. So a higher end reel can have an advantage.
So I was right for once.
You were right for once.
Kind of. No, that was totally joking, but Lance is right. You want to make sure that your line doesn't slip through. It can damage your leader without you knowing it. You lose fish, or it could screw up your fly line, and then you got to put a different fly line on there.
Perfect. Other things to consider when you're buying a Euro specific reel. Obviously, a nice drag is handy. But one of the most important things I think to think about is you're buying a long light rod, so you're usually buying, let's say, a 10.5 foot 3-weight. You, however, don't want a 3-weight reel. The reason for that is the 3-weight reel is designed usually to balance with like a 7.5 foot 3-weight rod, not a 10.5 foot 3-weight rod. So usually we're using larger diameter 5 and 6-weight reels. They'll help balance a lot easier.
So Lance has the Lamson Lightspeed Micro 5. That's one of my all-time favorite reels. This one's also really cool, and the new Ross Gunnison. So this has a really smooth drag, but it also has a little bit of bulk to it, and it's an absolute workhorse.
Yeah, there's lots of cool reels out there. They come in great colors. Pick your favorite. Just make sure you've got enough weight on it to balance the rod that you've chosen, and get yourself a nice thin Euro line, and you're all set.
The other thing with the reel is a lot of people, we've heard this, what's the difference between Euro and Tenkara? And the most obvious one is if you catch a big fish that wants to take drag, or if you foul hook a fish like Lance always does, it's going to want to take a bunch of line. And so when I fish Tenkara, I take my shirt off and I dive in after the fish and swim after it.
That's Lance, you just scare them to death and they swim out on the
right. But Lance can't do that, so Lance has to use a reel so that he can play it on the drag.
It is an advantage to have a nice drag.
Right. All right, so I have a fancy Euro nymphing line, and I really don't see why I can't just use my normal 5-weight line on Euro nymphing, since I don't have much line out of my rod anyway. It's just mostly leader.
It is mostly leader, that's true. However, Cheech is being a little coy here, of course, for our benefit. But the
Dad jokes.
Dad jokes. The Euro line in particular is really, really thin, probably 1/3 the diameter of, let's say, a 5-weight line. So there's a couple of important parts there. One is when you're fishing at distance and you're using a Euro rig with the line extending from the rod, this has a lot less mass. So instead of hanging vertical from the rod, it will hang at a shallower angle and allow you to fish further away. There is one trick you'll read online and other places that people will tell you can just use a long leader, which is true. You could use a leader that's so long that you don't even use this fly line. However, the disadvantage to that is when you're stripping in line, when you're setting the hook, you're at the mercy of that monofilament. That monofilament is not like a fly line. It's not designed to be handled, so it slips. It'll slip against the cork. It'll slip when you're fighting a fish. For me, when I try really long leaders, it's especially when I'm landing the fish at the very end of the fight. I'm trying to apply maximum pressure, and that's when that mono slips. The fly line, even though it's thin, still feels and acts like fly line, so it's just much easier to manage, in addition to giving you the benefits of fishing farther away. One last thing, the regular fly line is so heavy that when you only have a few feet of it, and it doesn't even get out the rod rings, you make a cast, and the mass of the fly line will actually sag and pull back into your guides and even fall back between your the cork handle and the first guide. You'll get a big loop of line. So it takes you out of contact, it creates slack so you're not setting the hook as quick, etc., etc. Can you catch fish with a regular line? Yes, but just like the long rod, having a Euro specific line is a big advantage.
The other thing is if you have a heavy line and you do have the sag in your leader as you're trying to tight line to fish at distance, the key thing to remember is you're not getting a drag-free drift with that. You know, it's going to kind of push the water down. It's harder to get a drag-free drift anyway. And then also setting the hook on a fish, you're not going to be as tight to them.
True.
So we're going to build a leader. This is the most confusing part. So I haven't done Euro nymphing near as long as Lance, and this was the part that would confuse me the most. This was the most intimidating. I knew I could get a rod and a reel, get it strung up, but actually building a leader and starting to present that was probably the most challenging part for me.
Fair enough. Yeah, we get asked a lot about leaders. In our videos, Modern Nymphing and Modern Nymphing Elevated, we shared some leader formulas. The one that I shared in the first one was a Maxima 2015-12, so you can see the specs on it there. But We're also going to have a leader building video that we'll put a link in on the bottom part of your screen. So if you're interested in that, check that guy out. But leaders are a little bit confusing in that it's hard to buy just a regular taper leader off the shelf. We do carry a Rio version that's ready to go. It's not our favorite setup, but if you're a little shy of tying knots, it might be the best option to get you started. That said, we use very specific materials to build leaders. One is Maxima Chameleon, and the other one is Amnesia from Sunset. The reasons that we use those are mostly for their memory or lack of memory. So you can see, hopefully, that this Maxima has a lot of coil to it right now. The thing we like about Maxima is that you can give, let me back up, Maxima Chameleon, is that you can give it a nice stretch and it will lay nice and straight. So it's really easy to release the memory. There's nothing magic about the brown color, just that it releases its memory really easily. The Amnesia from Sunset also does that same thing. So Maxima Chameleon or Amnesia. Amnesia comes in bright colors, Maxima Chameleon more of a brown color.
The other thing is, you know, a lot of people ask, well, the cider material, I need a specific cider or it won't work. And the idea behind the cider, which is connected to the leader that you're going to build, is kind of choose the one that you can see the best. You know, if you have thicker cider material, you're going to be able to see it from further away. It's going to cause a little bit more sag, but you're going to be able to cast it a little bit more accurately. You're going to be able to see it a little bit better. But it's kind of your own personal choice and however you choose to fish that leader. Lance and I were fishing, and I had a much thicker leader set up than him, and he was able to fish further away from the fish than I was. I'd have to use my Sasquatch sneaky skills to get right up on the fish because I had thicker butt sections of I think I had chameleon and a thicker cider.
Fair, yeah, which is a good point. So the 2015-12 leader that's in the videos is a really good starting point. It's not very thick. It's quite a bit thinner butt section than you'd find in a regular tapered leader, but it's thick enough to aid in turnover and accuracy. So the thinner you get on leaders, the farther away you'll be able to fish, but the more challenging the casting will be. So if you try and just right out of the gates, you've never Euro nymphed before, and you run like a straight 8 or 10 pound test leader for the entire piece, you're going to really struggle with accuracy. It's better to start thick, and as you get comfortable with it, then graduate and get thinner and thinner and thinner.
And that goes right back to the rods. If you have a rod that's specifically designed for Euro nymphing that has a soft tip, you're going to be able to cast those thinner rigs, the more difficult rigs, a little bit better.
Perfect.
What about tippet rings?
Tippet rings are handy. We use tippet rings. They come in various sizes. We mostly, for Euro nymphing, use 2 millimeters, most common. Especially when you're going from a slightly thicker cider down to really thin tippet. Most of the time we're using, 5, 5.5, 6x tippet for Euro nymphing. On the heavy end of things, 4x. We're not usually using thick tippets. So when you try and connect really thin tippet material to the relatively thicker cider material...
Wait, let me get something really thick. Use that.
Oh, brother. No. The knots don't link up very well. So you need to have something in there that will transition from the thicker cider to the thinner tippet, and the tippet ring does that very well. So if you don't have tippet rings, I think you'll find they're really handy in lots of fishing situations, but specifically here.
So the general idea is you can choose what your butt section's like, different colors if you want, different materials, and then you tie on the cider, typically with blood knots you're doing these. At the end of the cider, you tie on your tippet ring, and that's where you tie on your tippet, whatever length or size. And Lance will go much further into depth on that in his leader building video.
Perfect, yeah. So in a nutshell, like Cheech said, get a cider you can see. Generally speaking, you want your leader, let's say, including tippet. So from fly line to your terminal fly should be anywhere in the neighborhood of 18 to maybe 25 feet. Most of the time I'm fishing them about 20 to 21 feet. So that makes a butt section, let's call it, from the fly line to the cider, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to maybe 15 feet, even 16 if you want to make it really long, and then you're running just straight tippet from the tippet ring down. Okay,
so the final thing with Euro nymphing is choosing the right flies. And a lot of people, we hear this all the time. Well, the flies in my river, or the fish in my river only eat really small stuff, so I can't Euro nymph. And so that's not always the case. So we're going to talk a little bit about fly selection and go from there. And this is where I'll ask Lance, because you know.
I know. Well, I like to try and figure it out at least. Yeah, fly selection, I think, as Cheech mentioned, generally speaking, we tend to fish slightly larger patterns with Euro rig than you probably would with an indicator rig. That's not always true, but in most situations. Our local tailwater here, the Provo, most guides all winter long are fishing 6 and 7X with 20s, 22s, and 24s. And those of us who are Euro nymphing are catching most of our fish on 10s, 12s, 14s, and 16s. It's not to say the small flies won't work. It's just you don't normally have to get that small with the Euro rig. We hear that that's the case in lots of places. In fact, in our videos, some people even went to the trouble of messaging me on Facebook or Instagram saying, I really like your videos. However, next time I'd like to see you film them on tailwaters where you have to fish small flies. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that we filmed basically all of our videos on tailwaters where most people fish small flies. You just don't have to with this technique. Even on the trickiest of tailwaters, you'll still find some fish that are going to eat some bigger flies, and you might even be surprised you might catch more fish throwing bigger flies than you thought possible. Otherwise, fly pattern, as I've mentioned in lots of my presentations, I think that presentation trumps fly pattern, but one consistent thing you have to consider when you're Euro nymphing is you don't have weight that you can just add to the leader. So you need to have, one, a variety of patterns, hopefully in your confidence flies, and more important than that, you need to have a range of weights in each of those patterns. So if you took, a red dart or a Frenchie or something like that, you want to have them in, a lightweight version, a medium weight version, and a heavyweight version to help you get down deep or to stay shallow. So it's
one thing on that too that I think a lot of people don't realize is you're talking about a size 14 fly with maybe 3 different sizes of beads. So you have the 3.8 mil beads on the top, the 3.3s on the middle, and just as an example.
Sure.
So yeah, that's something that I had learned as well as I flailed in the river trying to get deeper.
Yeah, it's nice to have a range. Again, you don't have the ability to have weights on. I guess you could add weights, but you don't want to add sinkers to your rig because then you're in contact with the sinkers. The advantage of the Euro rig, or one of the advantages anyway, is that you're in direct contact with the fly because it is your weight. So it's just most important to have a selection of weighted flies ranging in weights and ranging in patterns.
Yeah, another thing is the trick with Euro nymphing is getting your flies down to where the fish are. And another technique that you can use is using a really thin tippet. So if you're using, say, a 5X and you don't want to change the size of your flies, you could jump down to a 6X or a 5.5 if you're using the trout hunter stuff, and that will actually help your flies get down quite a bit as well. Another thing to consider is, like, if you have a fly like a perdigon here, it has no appendages, so it's going to cut through the water much better than a fly with like a bunch of soft hackle on it or something. So the more slim your flies are, like say the thread Frenchie, which produces all year, it's going to cut through the water much better. And if you fish a thin fly with a thin tippet, it's going to cut through the water and you're going to be able to get a lot deeper than you thought you would.
Right, so to Cheech's point, density is more important than weight. You could have a fly that weighs less than another, but it might actually sink quicker, the one that weighs less, because of the way it's designed. They're designed to sink really, really quick.
All right, so you've got the tools, you've seen the rods, you've seen the reels, the lines, how to build a leader, and finally the flies. So the best thing for you is to go to the river, stick to a Euro rig until you start catching fish. You'll be able to dial it in, and hopefully this video helps you get a little bit more confidence with Euro nymphing.
Editor's note, Curtis just let us know, we failed to mention that if you click on the link below, you can see much of our Euro nymphing offering.
Yeah.